My heart pounded as I stared at my phone screen. The voice on the other end had just said the words that would change everything. "Mr. Blackstone, your father left you a trust fund worth $1.8 million. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The world shifted beneath my feet as the lawyer continued explaining details I could barely process. My father, the man I thought had abandoned me to my stepmother's cruelty, had been planning my future all along. As I hung up, one thought crystallized in my mind: they had no idea their greed was about to backfire. Hey friend, if you like real gripping stories where justice hits hard and betrayal never goes unpunished, please subscribe. 3 years after my parents' funeral, I thought I'd lost everything to my stepfamily's greed. My name is Kieran Blackstone, and for the first 12 years of my life I thought I lived in paradise. Our family estate sat on 15 acres of rolling hills just outside Portland, Maine, a sprawling Victorian mansion with wraparound porches, towering oak trees and gardens that bloomed in every season. My father, Montgomery Blackstone, owned the largest construction company in New England, building luxury hotels and office complexes from Boston to Bangor. But the real magic of my childhood wasn't the mansion or the money, it was my father himself. Every evening after work, he'd find me in the library or out by the pond, scoop me up in his strong arms, and listen to every detail of my day. We'd spend hours building model airplanes, discussing history, or just talking about life while he taught me to fish. "Kieran," he'd say, his weathered hands guiding mine as we cast our lines into the still water, "remember that a man's worth isn't measured by what he has, but by what he does for the people he loves." My mother had died when I was 3, cancer took her quickly, leaving only faded photographs and my father's stories to keep her memory alive. But my father filled our home with so much love and laughter that I never felt the absence too keenly. He was my hero, my teacher, my whole world. That world shattered when I turned 12. Her name was Cordelia Ashworth, a striking woman with auburn hair and calculating green eyes who worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative. She targeted my father with the precision of a surgeon, appearing at charity galas where she knew he'd be present, always dressed to perfection and armed with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "She's just a friend helping me navigate social events," my father explained when I first asked about the elegant woman who'd started joining us for dinner. "You know how awkward I am at those fancy parties, son?" Within 6 months, Cordelia had moved into our home. Within a year, she'd become Mrs. Montgomery Blackstone. And she brought reinforcements, 2 children from her previous marriage: Bryant, who was 14 and had inherited his mother's cruel streak, and Sienna, who was 10 but already showed signs of her brother's entitled attitude. The change in our house was immediate and devastating. Cordelia redecorated everything, erasing any trace of my mother's gentle touch and replacing it with cold, modern furniture that looked expensive but felt unwelcoming. The warm family dinners where my father and I discussed books and business became formal affairs where Cordelia dominated the conversation with gossip about her social circle. But the worst change was in my father himself. The man who'd once given me his undivided attention now seemed distracted, distant. When I tried to tell him about my day at school, Cordelia would interrupt with some crisis involving Bryant's grades or Sienna's ballet recital. When I'd ask him to help with homework, he'd suggest I try to figure it out myself, or ask Cordelia, she's good with that sort of thing. Cordelia's treatment of me was masterful in its subtlety. She never openly cruel when my father was around, but she had 1,000 small ways of making me feel unwelcome in my own home. My belongings would mysteriously disappear or be accidentally damaged. My favorite meals stopped appearing on the dinner table, replaced by dishes I disliked but that Bryant and Sienna loved. When I mentioned wanting to join the school's debate team, Cordelia would sigh and mention how expensive the fees were, how much they were already spending on Bryant's sports equipment and Sienna's music lessons. "We have to be fair to all the children, Montgomery," she'd say with that practiced smile. "We can't show favoritism just because Kieran was here first." The phrase, "was here first," became her favorite way of dismissing my connection to the house, the family, the life I'd known before she arrived. As if my 12 years of being an only child with a devoted father were some kind of unfair advantage that needed to be corrected. Bryant and Sienna took their cues from their mother, treating me like an inconvenient houseguest who'd overstayed his welcome. Bryant would accidentally break my possessions, then act shocked when I got upset. Sienna would monopolize my father's attention during the rare moments when he tried to spend time with me, suddenly developing urgent needs that required immediate parental intervention. The house that had once felt like a magical kingdom became a prison where I walked on eggshells, constantly afraid of saying or doing something that would give Cordelia another reason to sigh and mention how difficult I was being. My father, caught between his new wife's complaints and my increasingly withdrawn behavior, seemed to choose the path of least resistance. Instead of investigating why his once happy son had become quiet and sullen, he simply accepted Cordelia's explanations that I was going through a phase, or having trouble adjusting to our new family dynamic. The breaking point came during my 13th birthday. I'd been looking forward to it for months, remembering how my father and I used to plan elaborate celebrations, treasure hunts around the property, camping trips, or visits to the air shows I loved. But when the day arrived, I discovered that Cordelia had planned a joint party with Bryant, whose birthday was 3 weeks later. "It's more efficient this way," she explained to my father while I stood in the kitchen, watching her direct the caterers who were setting up in our backyard. "And it teaches the boys to share and cooperate." The party was a nightmare of forced smiles and shared cake. All of Bryant's friends attended, but none of mine. Cordelia had forgotten to send invitations to my classmates. The gifts were primarily for Bryant, with a few token presents for me that Cordelia had clearly purchased at the last minute. When it came time to blow out the candles, Bryant got to make the first wish, and I had to pretend to be grateful for sharing my birthday with my stepbrother. My father, oblivious to my misery, kept making comments about how wonderful it was to see his boys getting along so well. But I caught him glancing at me once during the evening, a flicker of confusion in his eyes as if he was trying to remember something he'd forgotten. That night, I lay in my bed, the same room I'd occupied since I was 3, though now stripped of most of my personal belongings to make room for Bryant's overflow of sports equipment, and made a decision. If my father could forget who I was, if he could let this woman and her children erase everything we'd built together, then I'd stop trying to reclaim what was already lost. I became a ghost in my own home, speaking only when spoken to, keeping my grades high enough to avoid attention, and spending most of my free time at the town library or walking the paths through our property that Cordelia and her children never bothered to explore. I watched my father become increasingly absorbed in his new family's needs and demands, and I began to understand that the man who'd once taught me to fish and build model airplanes was disappearing, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. The final blow came when I overheard a conversation between Cordelia and her sister during a family barbecue when I was 15. I'd gone inside to get a book from the library when I heard their voices from the kitchen. "The boy's becoming such a problem," Cordelia was saying, her voice lacking the sweet tone she used around my father. "Always lurking around making Montgomery feel guilty. I swear he does it on purpose." "Can't you send him to boarding school?" her sister asked. "I've suggested it, but Montgomery still has some ridiculous sentimental attachment. Says Kieran's mother would have wanted him to grow up at home." Cordelia's laugh was cold and calculating. "But don't worry, I'm working on it. A few more years and the boy will be 18. Then he'll be someone else's problem." "What about the inheritance? Montgomery's will?" "Oh, that's all taken care of," Cordelia replied with satisfaction. "Montgomery updated everything after we married. The house, the business, everything goes to me first, then to be divided among all 3 children. But really, once I'm in control, I'll make sure Bryant and Sienna get what they deserve. Kieran can have whatever scraps are left." I stood frozen in the hallway, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Not only had my father allowed this woman to push me to the margins of my own family, but he'd also essentially written me out of my inheritance, the legacy my mother would have wanted me to have. That night, I made another decision. If they wanted to treat me like an outsider, I'd become one. I'd stop hoping for my father's attention, stop trying to reclaim my place in the family, and start preparing for the day when I'd be completely on my own. I threw myself into my studies with single-minded determination, maintaining a perfect GPA while working part-time jobs to save money for college applications and eventual independence. I joined the debate team, paying the fees myself, and excelled at forensics competitions, developing skills in research, argument, and strategic thinking that would serve me well in ways I couldn't yet imagine. My father occasionally noticed my achievements, a trophy here, a scholarship offer there, but his praise felt hollow, delivered with the same distracted politeness he'd use with a neighbor's child. Cordelia would smile and make appropriate comments while mentally calculating how my successes might benefit her own children's college prospects. By the time I turned 16, I'd essentially become a boarder in my own home, polite but distant, focused on my escape plan. I knew that once I graduated high school and left for college, there'd be nothing to draw me back. The house that had once been my sanctuary would belong entirely to Cordelia and her children, just as she'd always planned. But I underestimated how much more she had yet to take from me. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March of my senior year. I was in AP Biology when the school secretary knocked on our classroom door and whispered something to my teacher. Mrs. Henderson's face went pale as she called my name. "Kieran, you need to come to the office immediately. Someone's here to pick you up." I found Cordelia waiting in the main office, dressed in black and wearing an expression of practiced grief. She didn't speak during the drive home, but I didn't need her to explain. The ambulances and police cars in our driveway told me everything I needed to know. My father had suffered a massive heart attack at a construction site that morning. By the time the paramedics arrived, Montgomery Blackstone, the man who'd taught me to fish, who'd filled my childhood with love and laughter, who'd somehow forgotten how to be my father, was gone. The funeral was a blur of business associates, family friends, and social acquaintances who offered their condolences to Cordelia while treating me like a distant relative who'd happened to show up. I sat in the front pew of the church where my father had been married twice, listening to a pastor who barely knew him deliver generic platitudes about his life and legacy. But what I remember most clearly was Cordelia's performance. She was magnificent in her grief, elegant, dignified, heartbroken but strong. She spoke movingly about the love she'd shared with Montgomery, the family they'd built together, the future they'd planned. She made only one reference to me during her eulogy, mentioning how grateful she was that Montgomery had lived to see his son grow into such a fine young man. After the service, as we stood receiving condolences, I overheard fragments of conversations that revealed how completely Cordelia had rewritten our family's history. To hear her tell it, she'd been the great love of my father's life, the woman who'd helped him heal after my mother's tragic death and create a blended family filled with love and harmony. No one mentioned that I'd been living like a stranger in my own home for the past 6 years. That night, as I sat alone in my room while the rest of the family attended the wake downstairs, I realized that my father's death had completed my transformation from beloved son to inconvenient stepchild. Whatever tenuous connection had still existed between us was now gone forever, and I was completely at the mercy of a woman who'd never wanted me in her family. I was 17 years old, 4 months away from graduation, and about to discover just how far Cordelia was willing to go to erase me entirely. The months following my father's funeral passed in a haze of legal proceedings and family meetings from which I was systematically excluded. Cordelia handled everything with the efficiency of a CEO taking over a company, meeting with lawyers, accountants, and business partners while Bryant and Sienna resumed their lives with minimal disruption. I wasn't invited to these meetings, but I didn't expect to be. I knew what the will contained. Cordelia had made sure I understood my place in the family hierarchy years ago. I focused on finishing my senior year and securing enough scholarships to make college affordable, since I doubted my stepmother would be generous with education funding. My acceptance to Harvard arrived in April with a partial scholarship that would cover tuition but leave me responsible for room, board, and expenses. I'd saved about $8,000 from my part-time jobs, which would get me through my first year if I was careful. After that, I'd need loans or additional scholarships to continue. When I showed Cordelia the acceptance letter, her reaction was carefully neutral. "That's wonderful, Kieran," she said with the kind of smile she'd give to a neighbor's child who'd shown her a decent report card. "Your father would have been proud." I waited for her to mention college funding, but she simply handed the letter back and returned to her phone call with the estate attorney. The message was clear. I was on my own. 2 weeks before graduation, everything changed. I was in my room studying for final exams when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a Boston area code I didn't recognize. "Hello, is this Kieran Blackstone?" The voice was professional, businesslike. "Yes, this is Kieran. Mr. Blackstone, my name is Harrison Whitfield. I'm an attorney with Whitfield, Morrison and Associates. I represented your father in certain legal matters, and I need to meet with you urgently regarding your inheritance." My heart pounded as confusion washed over me. "I think there's been a mistake, Mr. Whitfield. My father's will has already been read. Everything goes to my stepmother." "I'm not talking about your father's will, son. I'm talking about a trust fund he established for you separately. Can you meet me tomorrow at my office in Portland? This is something we need to discuss in person, and it's crucial that you don't mention this conversation to anyone else." My hands were shaking as I agreed to the meeting. A trust fund? My father had never mentioned anything about a trust fund. And why the secrecy? The next day, I told Cordelia I was going to the library to study, then drove my beat-up Honda to downtown Portland. Whitfield's office was in one of the elegant brick buildings near the Old Port, the kind of place where wealthy families handled their serious legal business. Harrison Whitfield was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office walls were lined with law books and family photos, and his desk held a folder with my name written on it in my father's handwriting. "Kieran," he said, shaking my hand warmly, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man and a valued client. Please sit down." I settled into the leather chair across from his desk, my mind racing with questions. "I'm sure you're confused about why I asked you here," Mr. Whitfield began. "The truth is, your father established a trust fund for you when you were 12 years old, shortly after he remarried. The trust was designed to remain secret until you turned 18 or graduated high school, whichever came first." The world shifted beneath my feet. A trust fund? How much? $1.8 million, plus a property in Bar Harbor worth approximately $400,000. The fund has been growing steadily for 6 years through conservative investments. I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. But why didn't he tell me? Why keep it secret? Mr. Whitfield opened the folder and pulled out an envelope sealed with wax. "He left you a letter explaining his reasons. But before you read it, you need to understand something important. Your stepmother has no knowledge of this trust fund. Your father was very specific that it should remain confidential until you were legally an adult." With trembling hands, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. My father's familiar handwriting filled 2 pages, and as I read, tears began streaming down my cheeks. "My dear Kieran, if you're reading this letter, then I'm gone and you're 18 years old. I hope I lived long enough to see you graduate, to see you become the remarkable man I know you'll be. But if not, please know that every day of your life has been a blessing to me. I need you to understand why I created this trust fund in secret. When I married Cordelia, I believed I was giving you a mother and siblings, completing our family in a way that would honor your mother's memory. It took me far too long to realize that Cordelia saw you not as a son to love, but as an obstacle to her own children's inheritance. I watched you withdraw from our family, saw you become quiet and distant, and I made the mistake of believing Cordelia's explanations rather than trusting my own instincts. She convinced me that your behavior was normal for a teenager adjusting to a blended family. By the time I understood what was really happening, the damage to our relationship felt irreparable. I was a coward, Kieran. I was so desperate to make my new marriage work that I allowed my own son to become a stranger in his own home. I failed you in the most fundamental way a father can fail his child, and I will regret that for whatever time I have left. This trust fund is my attempt to ensure that you have the future you deserve, regardless of what happens to the rest of my estate. The money comes from investments I made before marrying Cordelia, funds that legally belong to you as my biological heir. The property in Bar Harbor was your mother's favorite place. She and I spent our honeymoon there, and we always planned to build a house there someday. I've instructed Harrison to keep this trust fund secret until you're old enough to handle it responsibly. Cordelia believes everything will go through the will she watched me sign, but she doesn't know about the assets I set aside for you years before I met her. Use this money to build the life you want, Kieran. Go to the best schools, travel the world, start a business, or simply use it as security while you find your own path. You owe nothing to Cordelia or her children. This is your inheritance from your mother and me. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness for the years I let you down, but I hope someday you'll understand that I loved you every single day, even when I was too foolish to show it properly. Your father always, Montgomery. I read the letter 3 times before I could speak, my throat tight with emotions I'd suppressed for years. My father hadn't forgotten me. He'd seen what was happening, understood Cordelia's manipulations, and taken steps to protect my future even while failing to protect our relationship. Mr. Whitfield, I finally managed. What do I need to do to access these funds? The trust becomes active on your 18th birthday, which is next week. I'll need you to sign some documents and provide identification, but after that you'll have complete control over the money. Your father left very few restrictions. He trusted you to use it wisely. As we completed the paperwork, my mind raced with possibilities. College was no longer a financial concern. I could go to Harvard without worrying about loans or part-time jobs. I could travel, explore careers, maybe even start a business someday. But first, I had to decide what to do with the knowledge I now possessed. Mr. Whitfield, does my stepmother have any legal claim to these funds? He shook his head firmly. None whatsoever. This trust was established with assets that were legally your father's before his marriage. Cordelia has no knowledge of it and no right to it. What about the house and the business? Those will go through the will as planned. Cordelia will inherit the bulk of your father's estate, with provisions for all 3 children to share in certain assets. But this trust fund is separate from all of that. I left the meeting feeling like I was walking in a dream. In one afternoon, my entire future had changed. I was no longer a powerless stepchild dependent on Cordelia's charity. I was a wealthy young man with options I'd never dared imagine. But as I drove home, a different thought began to take shape. I remembered Cordelia's conversation with her sister about my inheritance, her casual dismissal of my rights, her certainty that she could control my father's legacy. I thought about all the ways she'd made me feel unwelcome in my own home, all the small cruelties and calculated humiliations. Most of all, I thought about how she'd prevented my father from being the man he wanted to be, how she'd poisoned our relationship with her constant manipulations and complaints about my presence in their perfect blended family. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to reveal the trust fund to Cordelia, not yet. First, I wanted to see exactly what her plans were for our family home and my father's legacy. I had a feeling that what I discovered would determine how I chose to use my newfound financial freedom. That evening at dinner, I sat quietly as usual while Cordelia discussed her plans for right-sizing our living situation now that Montgomery's gone. Bryant was headed to State College in the fall on a baseball scholarship, and Sienna would be starting high school. They'd been discussing the possibility of selling the house and moving to something smaller and more manageable. "It's really too much space for just the three of us," Cordelia was saying. "And the maintenance costs are enormous. I think Montgomery would want us to be practical." I said nothing, but inside I was calculating. Our family home sat on some of the most valuable real estate in southern Maine. Cordelia was right that it was expensive to maintain, but she was wrong about why she wanted to sell it. She wanted the cash, probably several $1,000,000, to fund the lifestyle she'd always believed she deserved. As I excused myself from dinner and headed to my room, I wondered what my father would think about his beloved family home being sold to fund Cordelia's dreams of luxury. More importantly, I wondered if there was anything I could do to stop it. The answer to that question would come sooner than I expected, and it would test everything I'd learned about strategy, patience, and justice over the past 6 years of living as an outsider in my own family. 2 weeks after my meeting with Mr. Whitfield, I graduated from high school as valedictorian, an achievement that earned me polite congratulations from Cordelia and her children, but none of the pride and celebration my father would have shown. The ceremony felt hollow without him there, but I delivered my speech about perseverance and staying true to your values while looking directly at my stepfamily in the audience. The summer after graduation became a masterclass in observing human greed and manipulation. Now that I knew about my trust fund, I felt like I was watching Cordelia and her children through a completely different lens. Instead of feeling hurt by their dismissive treatment, I began to see it as valuable intelligence gathering. Cordelia wasted no time in transforming from grieving widow to savvy businesswoman. Within days of my graduation, she began scheduling meetings with real estate agents, appraisers, and financial advisors. She also started making subtle changes to the household that signaled her true intentions. The first sign was when she moved into my father's home office, claiming she needed the space to manage his business affairs. She spent hours there with the door closed, making phone calls and reviewing documents. When I walked past one afternoon, I overheard her speaking to someone about liquidating assets and maximizing the estate's value. The second sign was more personal and infinitely more painful. Cordelia began systematically removing traces of my mother from the house. Photos, personal items, even the rose garden my mother had planted and my father had lovingly maintained. When I asked her about it, she claimed she was helping the family move forward and creating space for new memories. "It's not healthy to live in the past, Kieran," she said with that practiced sympathetic smile. "Your father would want us to focus on building our future, not dwelling on what we've lost." But I knew what she was really doing. She was erasing my connection to the house, removing any evidence that this had ever been my family's home before she arrived. If she succeeded in selling the property, she wanted to ensure that no future buyer would see reminders of the Blackstone family legacy that predated her marriage. The third sign was the most revealing of all. In late June, I overheard a conversation between Cordelia and her sister Priscilla that revealed the true scope of her plans. I'd been in the library reading when I heard voices from the adjacent sitting room. The doors between the rooms were closed, but they weren't soundproof, and Cordelia's voice carried when she got excited. "The appraisals came back even higher than I expected," she was saying. "The house and property are worth at least $3.8 million, maybe more in the current market. The business is worth another $2.5 million, though I'll probably sell it to Montgomery's partner rather than try to run it myself." "That's wonderful, Delia," Priscilla replied. "You'll be set for life." "More than set. I'm thinking about buying that oceanfront condo in Miami we looked at last spring. Brian can finish college, Sienna can go to whatever prep school she wants, and I can finally live the life I deserve. What about Kieran? There was a pause, and when Cordelia spoke again, her voice had that cold edge I remembered from years of living under her roof. What about him? He's 18 now, legally an adult. He has his college scholarship, and he's perfectly capable of making his own way in the world. I've done my duty as his stepmother, more than his duty, frankly. I housed and fed him for 6 years, even when he made it clear he resented our family's presence. But doesn't Montgomery's will provide for him? Of course it does. He'll get his share when everything is settled, probably enough to pay for college and get him started in life. But the bulk of the estate rightfully belongs to me and my children. I was Montgomery's wife after all. Kieran is just his son from his first marriage. Just his son from his first marriage. The phrase hit me like a slap. In Cordelia's mind, my 17 years as Montgomery Blackstone's beloved child counted for nothing compared to her 6 years as his wife. When are you planning to sell? Priscilla asked. As soon as possible. I've already gotten preliminary offers from 3 different developers who want the land for luxury housing projects. The house itself is too old-fashioned for modern buyers, but the location is perfect. I could have a signed contract by the end of the summer. And you're not worried about Kieran objecting? Cordelia laughed, a sound without warmth. Object to what? He has no legal standing to challenge my decisions. The will is ironclad. Everything goes to me first, then gets distributed according to Montgomery's wishes. Kieran will get his portion whether he likes it or not, but he certainly can't stop me from selling assets that legally belong to me. What if he tries to cause problems? He won't. Kieran's always been a quiet, passive boy. He'll grumble and sulk, but he doesn't have the backbone to actually fight me. Besides, what could he do? Hire a lawyer with what money? I sat frozen in the library chair, listening to this woman discuss my father's legacy like it was a commodity to be liquidated for her personal benefit. The house where my father had been born, where my parents had brought me home as a baby, where 3 generations of Blackstones had lived, she saw it all as nothing more than real estate to fund her retirement. But what struck me most was her complete dismissal of my ability to challenge her plans. She saw me as the same powerless stepchild I'd been for the past 6 years, never imagining that my circumstances had changed dramatically. That evening, I made a series of phone calls that would set my own plans in motion. First, I called Harrison Whitfield to discuss the mechanics of accessing my trust fund. The legal paperwork had been completed, and the money was now officially under my control. More importantly, Mr. Whitfield confirmed that I could use the funds for any purpose I chose, including real estate purchases. Next, I researched property law in Maine and learned about the process of buying real estate through shell companies and intermediaries. I discovered that it was perfectly legal to conceal the identity of a buyer during a transaction, especially if the purchase was being made through a trust or investment company. Finally, I began making discreet inquiries about Cordelia's financial situation. What I learned was both fascinating and useful. Despite her wealthy widow act, Cordelia had very little money of her own. Her first marriage had ended in divorce with a modest settlement, and she'd been living paycheck to paycheck as a pharmaceutical sales rep before meeting my father. Every expensive purchase she'd made in recent years, the designer clothes, the luxury car, the elaborate vacations, had been funded by my father's generosity. Now that he was gone, Cordelia was facing the reality that maintaining her lifestyle would require liquidating his assets. She genuinely needed to sell the house and business to fund the future she'd planned for herself and her children, which meant she was vulnerable in ways she didn't realize. Over the following weeks, I watched Cordelia's preparations intensify. She hired a staging company to prepare the house for sale, packed away more family photos and personal items, and began showing the property to potential buyers. Each time strangers walked through the rooms where I'd grown up, examining my childhood home like a commodity, I felt my resolve strengthen. The final insult came in late July, when Cordelia announced at dinner that she'd accepted an offer from a development company that planned to tear down the house and build a subdivision of luxury condominiums. They offered $4.2 million, she said with satisfaction. More than any of the other buyers, and they don't want to negotiate on the details. We can close in 30 days. Bryant and Sienna cheered, already making plans for how they'd spend their inheritance. I sat quietly, calculating timelines and legal requirements in my head. What about Dad's things? I asked. His office, his personal belongings? I'll save anything that has sentimental value, Cordelia replied dismissively. But most of it will need to go. The buyers want vacant possession and I don't want to pay for storage. That night I made one final phone call to Harrison Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, I said, I need to buy a house. Of course, Kieran. The Bar Harbor property your father left you is lovely, but if you want something closer to your college. No, I interrupted. I want to buy my family's house in Portland. And I need to do it without anyone knowing I'm the buyer. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Son, are you sure about this? That's a significant purchase, even with your trust fund. I'm sure. My stepmother is planning to sell it to developers who want to tear it down. I can't let that happen. This will require some complex maneuvering, but it's doable. I'll need a few days to set up the proper legal structures. Mr. Whitfield, I said, feeling my father's strength in my voice for the first time in years, I have something else I need you to help me plan. When this is all over, I want to make sure my stepfamily understands exactly who they've been underestimating. As I hung up the phone, I thought about Cordelia's words. He doesn't have the backbone to actually fight me. She was about to discover just how wrong she'd been about that. The next 2 weeks required the kind of careful planning and strategic thinking that my years of academic success had prepared me for, combined with a newfound ruthlessness that I'd inherited from my father's business acumen. Harrison Whitfield proved to be an invaluable ally, helping me navigate the complex legal and financial maneuvers necessary to execute my plan. First, we established Oceanic Holdings LLC, a shell company registered in Delaware with sufficient legal complexity to obscure its true ownership. The company's listed address was Whitfield's law firm, and its stated purpose was real estate acquisition and development. On paper, it appeared to be exactly the kind of investment group that routinely purchased luxury properties along the Maine coast. Next, we arranged financing that would allow Oceanic Holdings to make a cash offer without requiring traditional mortgage approvals or lengthy due diligence periods. My trust fund provided more than enough capital for the purchase, but we structured the transaction to appear as though the company had multiple investors and significant liquid assets. The most delicate part of the operation was timing. Cordelia had accepted an offer from Pinnacle Development Group for $4.2 million with a 30-day closing period. I needed Oceanic Holdings to present a superior offer that she couldn't refuse, but I also needed to ensure that my identity remained secret until the moment of maximum impact. On a Tuesday morning in early August, Cordelia received a phone call that changed everything. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when her phone rang. I could hear her voice from the living room, initially professional but quickly becoming excited. Yes, this is Cordelia Blackstone. An offer? I already have a signed contract. How much? There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had risen in pitch. 5.6 million? Gosh, are you certain? I continued making my eggs, fighting to keep my expression neutral as I listened to her side of the conversation with Harrison Whitfield's carefully chosen real estate agent. Oceanic Holdings. Yes, I've heard of them. They do luxury developments along the coast. No contingencies at all? And they can close in 15 days. By the time she hung up, Cordelia was practically vibrating with excitement. She immediately called Bryant and Sienna into the room, her face flushed with triumph. We just got a better offer, she announced. Oceanic Holdings wants to pay $5.6 million cash. That's almost $1.5 million more than Pinnacle was offering. Bryant whooped with delight. Mom, we're going to be rich. We already were rich, sweetheart, Cordelia replied with a smile that revealed her true nature. Now we're going to be very rich. Sienna was already calculating her share. How much will I get for college? Can I apply to those private schools in Switzerland we looked at? You can apply anywhere you want, Cordelia assured her. With this kind of money, we can afford the best of everything. I finished my breakfast in silence, marveling at how easily they dismissed any connection between the house and family legacy. To them, the Blackstone family estate was nothing more than a lottery ticket that had finally been drawn. Over the next week, I watched Cordelia negotiate with Oceanic Holdings through their representatives, completely unaware that she was essentially negotiating with her own stepson. Harrison had chosen his agents well, experienced professionals who understood the need for discretion and who presented themselves as representatives of a legitimate investment group. Cordelia's greed made the negotiation surprisingly easy. When Oceanic requested a slightly shorter closing period, she agreed immediately. When they asked for detailed property surveys and inspections, she hired the best companies in Portland to ensure everything was perfect. She even agreed to leave certain valuable fixtures and antiques that had been in my family for generations, assuming that the development company would simply dispose of them. Meanwhile, I began preparing for the revelation that would expose her true nature to the community that had respected my father's memory. I reached out to several of my father's longtime friends and business associates, ostensibly to discuss college plans and share memories of him. During these conversations, I carefully mentioned Cordelia's plans to sell the family estate to developers who intended to tear it down. The reaction was exactly what I'd expected. These men and women had known my father for decades, had attended his first wedding to my mother, had watched him build his business and raise his family in the house that had been in the Blackstone family for 3 generations. The idea that Cordelia would allow developers to destroy it for profit horrified them. "Your father loved that house," said Thomas Morrison, who'd been my father's partner in several construction projects. "He spent years restoring the original features, preserving the family history. He'd turn over in his grave if he knew someone was going to tear it down for condos." I tried to convince her to reconsider, I replied with carefully modulated sadness. "But she says it's too expensive to maintain, and the offer is too good to refuse." "What about you, son? Don't you have any say in this?" "I'm just the stepson," I said, using Cordelia's own dismissive phrase. "According to the will, everything goes to her first. I'll get my portion eventually, but I can't stop her from selling." These conversations served multiple purposes. They established my narrative as the powerless stepchild being steamrolled by his greedy stepmother, they spread word throughout the community about Cordelia's intentions, and they ensured that when the truth eventually came out, I would have witnesses to her character and motivations. The closing was scheduled for Friday, August 18th at Harrison Whitfield's office. Cordelia spent the preceding week in a state of barely contained euphoria, shopping for luxury furniture and booking flights to Miami to look at oceanfront condominiums. "Once this closes, we'll have enough liquid capital to invest properly," she explained to Bryant and Sienna over dinner. "Real estate, stocks, maybe even a small business. Your father was too conservative with his money, but I understand how to make capital work for us." I bit my tongue at this revisionist history. My father's conservative approach to money had built a multi-million-dollar construction business and accumulated enough wealth to support his family in luxury for generations. But Cordelia needed to believe that she was the financial genius who would elevate them to new heights of prosperity. On Thursday evening, she made an announcement that revealed the depths of her selfishness. "Kieran," she said as we finished dinner, "I'll need you to be moved out by the end of next week. The new owners want to take possession immediately after closing, and I don't want any complications." "Moved out to where?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she'd rationalized this decision. "You're 18 years old and starting college in a few weeks," she replied with the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "It's time you learned to live independently. I found you a nice studio apartment near the university. The rent is reasonable, and you'll have enough from your inheritance to cover expenses until you graduate." Bryant snickered. "Maybe living on your own will teach you some responsibility, bro. I've already arranged to have the utility deposits paid," Cordelia continued, as if she were doing me an enormous favor. "Consider it my graduation gift." I nodded politely, accepting this final insult with the same grace I'd shown for years of smaller ones. But inside, I was calculating the timing perfectly. By the end of next week, Cordelia would understand exactly what it felt like to be told you had to move out of the only home you'd ever known. Friday morning arrived with perfect late summer weather. Cordelia dressed like she was attending a gala, choosing an expensive suit and her best jewelry for the closing. Bryant and Sienna were both planning to attend. They wanted to witness the moment their family's financial future was secured. I told Cordelia I had a job interview and wouldn't be able to join them, which was partially true. I did have an appointment that morning, just not the kind she imagined. At 10:30 a.m., I walked into Harrison Whitfield's office through the private entrance he'd shown me weeks earlier. He was waiting with the final documents that would transfer ownership of Oceanic Holdings LLC to me personally, making me the official owner of my family's estate. "Are you ready for this, Kieran?" he asked, studying my face carefully. "Once we do this, there's no going back. Your stepfamily will know exactly what you think of them." "Mr. Whitfield," I said, signing the papers with steady hands, "they've spent 6 years teaching me exactly what they think of me. Today they get to learn what I think of them." At 11 a.m., Cordelia, Bryant, and Sienna arrived for their appointment with Destiny. I could hear their excited voices in the reception area as they discussed their plans for the windfall they were about to receive. At 11:15 a.m., Harrison Whitfield would walk into that conference room and begin the closing process that would transfer ownership of their home to Oceanic Holdings LLC. And at approximately 11:45 a.m., Cordelia Ashworth Blackstone was going to discover that her stepson had far more backbone than she'd ever imagined. I waited in Harrison's private office while the closing proceeded in the main conference room down the hall. Through the closed door, I could hear muffled voices, Cordelia's occasionally rising in excitement, Bryant and Sienna's laughter, and Harrison's measured professional tone as he guided them through the paperwork. The process took exactly 32 minutes. I know because I watched every second tick by on the antique clock on Harrison's desk, my heart pounding with anticipation and nervous energy. When the voices in the conference room fell silent, I knew they'd reached the moment of truth. Harrison had planned this revelation with the precision of a master strategist. The closing documents had been signed, the money had been transferred, and legal ownership of the Blackstone family estate now belonged to Oceanic Holdings LLC. Only then would he reveal the final surprise. I heard footsteps in the hallway, then Harrison's voice calling my name. "Kieran? Could you join us in the conference room, please?" This was it. I walked down the hallway with steady steps, despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. When I entered the conference room, I found Cordelia, Bryant, and Sienna seated around the polished mahogany table, all three wearing expressions of confused curiosity. Stacks of signed documents lay between them, along with a cashier's check for $5.6 million. "Kieran," Cordelia said with forced pleasantness, "what are you doing here? I thought you had a job interview this morning." "I did," I replied, taking a seat across from them. "It went very well." Harrison cleared his throat and opened a final folder. "Before we conclude today's business, I need to make an important disclosure to all parties. Mrs. Blackstone, you've just sold your property to Oceanic Holdings LLC. What you don't know is that Oceanic Holdings is owned by someone you know quite well." Cordelia frowned. "What do you mean?" "Oceanic Holdings LLC is wholly owned by Kieran Blackstone," Harrison said calmly. "Which means, Mrs. Blackstone, that you've just sold the family home to your stepson." The silence in the room was absolute. Cordelia stared at Harrison as if he'd spoken in a foreign language, her brain struggling to process what she'd heard. Bryant's mouth fell open in shock. Sienna looked back and forth between me and her mother, confusion written across her face. "That's impossible," Cordelia finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kieran doesn't have that kind of money. He's a college student working part-time jobs." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a document Harrison had prepared for this moment. A copy of my trust fund statement showing the current balance of $1.2 million, along with documentation of the Bar Harbor property my father had left me. "My father established a trust fund for me when I was 12 years old," I said, sliding the papers across the table. $1.8 million plus property. "He kept it secret from you because he knew exactly what kind of person you were." Cordelia snatched the documents, her hands trembling as she read. Her face cycled through a range of emotions: disbelief, anger, fear, and finally something approaching panic. "This can't be legal," she said desperately. "Montgomery never told me about any trust fund. If he had money hidden from me, that's fraud. I can contest this." Harrison shook his head firmly. "The trust fund was established with assets that were legally Montgomery's before your marriage. You have no claim to it whatsoever. And the sale of the house is completely legitimate. You accepted the offer, signed the papers, and accepted payment. The transaction is final." Bryant found his voice first, though it came out as an angry snarl. "You little rat. You tricked us." "I didn't trick anyone," I replied calmly. "I made you a legitimate offer that you accepted. The fact that you didn't know who was making the offer doesn't invalidate the sale." "But why?" Sienna asked, tears starting in her eyes. "Why would you do this to us?" I looked at each of them in turn, these people who had made my life miserable for 6 years, who had treated me like an unwanted stranger in my own home. "Because this house belongs to my family," I said. "It was built by my great-grandfather, expanded by my grandfather, and lovingly maintained by my father. My mother planted roses in the garden and picked out every piece of furniture in the living room. This isn't just real estate to be liquidated for your vacation fund, it's my family's legacy." Cordelia's shock was transforming into rage. "Your family?" she spat. "I was married to your father for 6 years. My children lived in that house. We are your family." "No," I said quietly. "You're people who married into my family for money and status. You spent 6 years making me feel like I didn't belong in my own home, treating me like an inconvenient obligation you couldn't wait to get rid of. Well, now you know how it feels." "What are you going to do?" she asked, and for the first time since I'd known her, Cordelia Ashworth Blackstone sounded truly frightened. "Are you going to throw us out on the street?" I'd been waiting for this question and I'd prepared my answer carefully. You have 2 weeks to move out, I said. I'll arrange for a moving company to help you relocate your personal belongings. As for where you go, that's up to you. You have $5.6 million. I'm sure you can find suitable accommodations. 2 weeks. Bryant exploded. That's not enough time to find a place. It's more notice than your mother gave me, I replied. She told me last night that I had to be out by the end of next week because the new owners wanted immediate possession. Harrison began gathering the signed documents. I believe our business here is concluded. Mrs. Blackstone, your check will clear within 2 business days. Kieran, the deed transfer will be recorded with the county by Monday morning. Congratulations on your new home. Cordelia stood on unsteady legs, clutching the cashier's check like a lifeline. This isn't over, she said, her voice shaking with fury and humiliation. I'll find a way to fight this. Montgomery would never have wanted. Montgomery left me a letter explaining exactly what he wanted, I interrupted, pulling out my father's handwritten note. Would you like me to read the part where he talks about your true motivations for marrying him? She went pale, realizing that her carefully constructed narrative about being my father's devoted wife was about to crumble. He knew, Cordelia, I continued. He knew you saw me as an obstacle to your children's inheritance. He knew you were manipulating him against his own son. And he took steps to make sure you could never completely win. Bryant and Sienna looked stricken, finally understanding that the man they'd called their stepfather had seen through their mother's schemes. Sienna started crying openly, while Bryant's face flushed with shame and anger. Come on, Cordelia said to her children, her voice hollow. We're leaving. As they walked toward the door, I called out one final message. Cordelia. She turned back, her eyes blazing with hatred. The house comes with all original furnishings and family heirlooms, I said. I'd appreciate it if you only took items that actually belong to you. She stared at me for a long moment, perhaps finally seeing not the powerless stepchild she'd tormented for years, but the man I'd become despite her efforts to break me. Then she walked out, her children trailing behind her, leaving me alone with Harrison in the conference room that had just witnessed the most satisfying 30 minutes of my life. Well, Harrison said after the door closed, that went about as well as we could have hoped. I slumped in my chair, suddenly exhausted. Is it really over? Can she actually challenge this legally? She can try, Harrison replied, but she has no grounds. The trust fund predates her marriage, the sale was conducted properly, and we have your father's letter documenting his intentions. Any lawyer worth their fee will tell her she's wasting her money. I nodded, then asked the question that had been weighing on me throughout this entire process. Mr. Whitfield, do you think my father would approve of what I just did? The older man studied me carefully before answering. Son, your father spent the last years of his life regretting how he'd handled his marriage to Cordelia. He knew he'd failed you and he tried to make amends the only way he could. I think he'd be proud that you used his gift not for revenge, but to protect the family legacy he'd almost lost. As I walked out of that law office and into the bright August sunshine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the certainty that I was exactly where I belonged. The Blackstone family estate was mine again, protected from the developers who would have destroyed it, saved from the woman who had never understood its true value. But more than that, I'd finally proven to myself that I was my father's son in all the ways that mattered. I had his strength, his strategic mind, and his commitment to protecting what was truly important. Cordelia and her children would land on their feet. They had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of their lives if they were careful. But they would never again have the power to make anyone feel unwelcome in their own home. As I drove back to reclaim my childhood sanctuary, I thought about all the changes I wanted to make, all the family memories I wanted to restore. But first, I had to go home and begin the process of turning a house back into the family haven it was always meant to be. The 2 weeks following the closing were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For the first time in 6 years, I woke up each morning in a house where I truly belonged, where every room held memories of love and laughter rather than coldness and exclusion. Cordelia and her children moved through those final days like ghosts, packing their belongings with mechanical efficiency while avoiding eye contact with me. The woman who had once commanded every conversation now spoke in monosyllables, her confidence shattered by the revelation that she'd been outmaneuvered by the stepson she'd consistently underestimated. I made good on my promise to help with their relocation, hiring the best moving company in Portland and even arranging temporary housing at an extended stay hotel while they searched for a permanent home. It wasn't kindness, it was justice tempered with the mercy my father would have wanted me to show. The community's reaction to the news was everything I'd hoped for and more. Word spread quickly through Portland's business circles that Montgomery Blackstone's son had prevented the family estate from being destroyed by developers. The story grew in the telling, becoming a tale of filial loyalty triumphing over greed. Thomas Morrison was the first to call with congratulations. "Your father would be so proud, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That house has been in your family for 3 generations. It belongs to a Blackstone." More calls followed throughout the week. Business associates, family friends, and neighbors who remembered my parents' happy marriage reached out to express their support. Many admitted they'd been uncomfortable with Cordelia's decision to sell to developers but hadn't felt it was their place to intervene. "We all wondered what had happened to Montgomery's boy," said Mrs. Fletcher, who lived 2 houses down and had known me since I was a toddler. "You disappeared from family gatherings after he remarried, and that woman always had excuses for why you weren't around. Now we understand why." The validation was sweet, but what mattered more was the opportunity to reconnect with people who had genuinely cared about my father and remembered my mother with fondness. For years, Cordelia had isolated me from these family friends, either by excluding me from social events or by making my presence so uncomfortable that I'd avoided them myself. Now, as the rightful owner of the Blackstone estate, I found myself welcomed back into a community I'd never realized I'd lost. The most meaningful call came from my father's business partner, James Sullivan, who had continued running Blackstone Construction after my father's death. "Kieran," he said, "I don't know if you're interested, but there's a place for you in the company if you want it. Your father always hoped you'd join the business someday, and frankly we could use someone with your intelligence and integrity." I was touched by the offer, though I explained that I needed to finish college first. "But maybe during summers," I said. "I'd like to understand the business my father built." "The offer stands whenever you're ready," James replied. "It would be good to have a Blackstone working here again." On the final day of Cordelia's residence in what was now legally my home, she made one last attempt to regain some control over the narrative. I found her in the kitchen, packing the last of her personal items, when she suddenly turned and faced me with something approaching her old commanding presence. "I want you to know that I don't regret marrying your father," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "He was lonely after your mother died and I gave him 6 years of happiness. My children gave him the family he wanted." I considered her words carefully before responding. "My father was never lonely when it was just the 2 of us," I said. "He was complete. You convinced him he needed more, but what you gave him wasn't happiness, it was complications he was too kind to recognize." "You're 18 years old," she replied with a flash of her old arrogance. "You don't understand adult relationships or the sacrifices people make for love." "I understand that love doesn't require sacrificing your existing children for your new spouse's comfort," I said. "I understand that a loving stepmother doesn't spend 6 years making a child feel unwelcome in his own home. And I understand that if you truly loved my father, you wouldn't be so eager to destroy everything he treasured just to fund your retirement." For a moment, her composure cracked, and I saw something that might have been genuine remorse in her eyes. But it was gone quickly, replaced by the cold calculation that had defined her for as long as I'd known her. "You win, Kieran," she said finally. "You have your house, your money, and your precious family legacy. But you're still an 18-year-old boy living alone in a house too big for one person, surrounded by memories of people who are dead and gone. I hope that's enough for you." "It's enough for now," I replied. "But I won't always be living here alone. I was thinking of the family I might someday have, the children who would grow up in this house with love and security, the way I had for my first 12 years. But Cordelia didn't need to know that. After they left, I walked through every room of the house, reacquainting myself with spaces that had felt forbidden for so long. In my father's study, I found photo albums that Cordelia had hidden away, pictures of my parents' wedding, my first steps, family vacations to Bar Harbor, Christmas mornings when it was just the 3 of us. I spent hours that evening restoring these photos to their rightful places throughout the house, bringing my mother's presence back into rooms where it belonged. I also found a box of my father's personal papers, including business documents that revealed the true scope of his success and financial planning. What struck me most was evidence of how carefully he'd protected my inheritance from any potential challenges. The trust fund hadn't been an afterthought or a gesture of guilt. It had been meticulously planned with multiple legal safeguards to ensure that no one could ever take it away from me. There were also draft letters that he'd apparently written but never sent, attempts to explain his choices and express his love that he'd never found the courage to give me directly. Reading them, I finally understood how much he'd struggled with the consequences of his remarriage, how deeply he'd regretted the distance that had grown between us. I see you pulling away, one letter read, and I don't know how to bridge the gap that's opened between us. Cordelia means well, but she doesn't understand that you're not just another stepchild to be managed. You're my son, my heart, the best part of who I am. I hope someday I'll find the words to tell you this in person. But he'd run out of time to find those words, and I'd run out of time to forgive him while he was alive to receive it. I spent the rest of that week preparing for college and planning the future of my reclaimed home. I would live in the dorms at Harvard as planned. The social experience would be valuable, and I wasn't ready to stay in Portland full-time. But I hired a property management company to maintain the estate, and I began planning renovations that would restore it to its original grandeur while adding modern conveniences. More importantly, I started reaching out to extended family members who had drifted away during the Cordelia years. My father's brother lived in California, and my mother's sister had moved to North Carolina after her own children were grown. Both had tried to maintain relationships with me after my father's remarriage, but Cordelia had made it clear that their presence complicated her vision of the perfect blended family. Now, as the owner of the family seat, I could re-establish these connections on my own terms. I invited them to visit during my Christmas break, promising to host the kind of family gathering that had been absent from the Blackstone home for far too long. The morning I left for Harvard, I stood in the foyer where I'd watched my mother plant daisies through the windows, where I'd waited for my father to come home from work each evening, where I'd felt like an unwelcome stranger for 6 long years. But it was also where I'd learned patience, strategic thinking, and the difference between justice and revenge. Cordelia had intended to break my connection to this place, but instead she taught me exactly how much it was worth fighting for. I thought about my father's letter, his hope that I would use his gift to build the life I wanted. Thanks to his foresight and protection, I had options that most 18-year-olds could only dream of. I could focus on my education without financial stress, explore different careers without worrying about student loans, and eventually return to Portland to build a family and a business legacy worthy of the Blackstone name. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in defeating your enemies, but in refusing to let them change who you are at heart. As I locked the front door and headed to Cambridge, I carried with me the certainty that I was exactly who my father had raised me to be in those first 12 years of love and security. The house would wait for me, protected and preserved, until I was ready to fill it with the kind of family it was always meant to shelter. Cordelia and her children would always be the people who had tried to steal my legacy and failed. But I would be the man who had reclaimed it, not through bitterness or cruelty, but through patience, planning, and an unshakable belief in the value of what was truly mine. In the end, that made all the difference. 5 years later, I returned to Portland after graduating from Harvard Law School, ready to take my place in the family business and the community where I belonged. The house had been perfectly maintained, and I'd spent my college breaks gradually restoring it to reflect both its history and my vision for its future. Cordelia had indeed landed on her feet, using her windfall to buy a luxury condominium in Florida and live comfortably off her investments. Bryant had finished college and found work in Miami, while Sienna had completed high school and started at a prestigious university. We maintained no contact, which suited all of us perfectly. But the real victory wasn't in their exodus, it was in what I'd built in their absence. The Blackstone estate once again hosted family gatherings, business dinners and community events. I'd married a wonderful woman who understood the house's history and helped me create new traditions while honoring the old ones. When our first child was born, I carried her through the same rooms where my father had carried me, telling her stories about her grandfather and grandmother, promising her the security and love that had been my birthright from the day I was born. The trust fund that had made my victory possible had grown through careful investment, providing not just personal security but the foundation for a charitable foundation in my parents' names. We funded scholarships for students who'd lost parents, supported historical preservation projects, and helped families stay in homes that carried their legacies. Sometimes I thought about how different my life might have been if my father had found the courage to stand up to Cordelia's manipulations, if he'd protected our relationship instead of hoping time would heal the wounds that daily neglect kept opening. But ultimately, I was grateful for the path we'd both walked. His failure had taught me the importance of fighting for what mattered, while his hidden planning had given me the tools to win that fight. The combination of his weakness and his love had created the man I'd become, someone who understood both the cost of passivity and the power of patient, strategic action. The Blackstone legacy was secure now, protected by someone who understood its true value and was prepared to defend it against anyone who might threaten it in the future. And that, I knew, would have made my father proud. Have you ever experienced family members who tried to push you out of your rightful place? Have you seen how greed can corrupt people who should be protecting family bonds? Share your thoughts about protecting family legacies and recognizing when stepfamily dynamics become toxic. What would you have done in Kieran's situation? If you enjoyed this story of patient justice and family loyalty triumphing over greed and manipulation, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next tale of consequences, catching up with those who underestimate the people they try to destroy.